The, the National Benevolent Association and Reconciliation Ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ are proud to offer part 2 of our 3-part webinar series focused on congregational and general church involvement in prison and jail issues. Today's topic is Incarceration, Justice, and Restoration, Tools to Equip Congregations to Reflect and Study Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. To begin, we will share information about the 2013 General Assembly Resolution, GA 1323, entitled Incarceration, Justice, and Restoration in the United States, and we'll explain why we as a church have been called to study this issue. We will then share some data about mass incarceration and describe how congregations can use this information and engage in a study of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. We will close by offering some additional resources and approaches about how congregations can get involved in prison-related topics. During this webinar, we invite you to use the live chat feature on your screen to submit any questions. If you're participating by phone, you may email your questions to Monica M. Kilpatrick at nbacares.org. That's MKILPATRICK at nbacares.org. After the presentation, we will address as many questions as possible. If your question is not answered here, we will follow up with you via email. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future use. So to begin, let me introduce our speakers. Reverend Dean Bucalis, ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, is presently serving as the pastor of New Life in Christ Christian Church Disciples of Christ, a congregation he began inside a women's reentry facility in Louisville, Kentucky. He is also the program coordinator of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, an ecumenical reentry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon their release from prison. Dean is a trained volunteer facilitator for the Juvenile Justice Pilot Program in Jefferson County, Kentucky, sponsored by Restorative Justice Louisville, and he currently serves as program coordinator for NBA's Prison and Jail Ministries Affinity Group. Also, we have Reverend April G. Johnson, who serves as the Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. She brings to this work a deep passion for racial justice and compassion. As Minister of Reconciliation, Reverend Johnson facilitates the church-wide process of awareness and action toward healing the fractures in the body of Christ caused by systemic racism. She collaborates with trained facilitators, regional and congregational staff leadership, and ecumenical partners to guide the church's effort toward racial reconciliation. In her capacity as both pastor and administrator, Reverend Johnson emphasizes the importance of relationship building across difference to promote pro-reconciliation as a guiding principle of the church's global witness. Welcome, and at this time, I turn the conversation over to our presenters.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar. We're very excited to share this information with you and to speak with you at the end of the presentation. As Monica intimated, I am Reverend April Johnson. I serve as your Minister of Reconciliation, and I want to share with you the genesis of this conversation around mass incarceration. In 2013, a business item entitled for reflection and research. I always want to say research and reflection. For reflection and research, GA 1323 was approved at the General Assembly for this biennium for the church-wide process of understanding this phenomenon we now know and call mass incarceration. It was presented to the General Assembly by East Dallas Christian Church, who, by the elders of that church. One of the elders had read the book and had a heart change about his understanding about what really contributes to racism and racial justice, and convinced the elders to do a book study. And the book study led to the presentation of this business item. And so this webinar, as a matter of fact, is a part of our church-wide process of doing reflection and research around mass incarceration. As you see on your screen, the business item asks the church to pay attention to these three components, and that is one, to make sure that we engage in a study about how the war on drugs has a disproportionate effect on communities of color and poor communities, and to learn ways about how to raise awareness about how to bring relief into those communities with regard to the mass incarceration of particularly our African American and Hispanic males, and then to explore ways in which disciples ourselves can support restoration, as Dean will speak to re-entry, ways in which we can welcome returning citizens into our communities. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Dean Bucalis.
That the Church Disciples of Christ has taken on as a study and reflection focus for the last couple of years, but in the years to come as well. But it's a topic that needs to be addressed by every citizen of the United States, because this is a growing concern. And what I'm going to talk about this evening is two things primarily. One, to set the context of this particular study, some background information so that we can have an understanding of why we are even engaging in this type of study on this particular topic. And then I'm going to talk about one method of addressing this through a book study and use the model that's being utilized in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, in the Kentucky region of the Christian Church. We begin by just examining what the definition of mass incarceration is. It's a term that has gotten a lot of press. We're hearing a lot more about it. I think Hillary Clinton is actually going to make a statement about it soon as she embarks on her presidential campaign. But what we understand it to be is the phenomena that has occurred in the United States in the context of our correction system, where we have a disproportionate number of African American males who have been incarcerated, which has affected our communities, our neighborhoods, and our families, particularly those of people of color. We're going to talk a little bit about why that is the case and how that has come about. First, some statistics just to put this into context. In the United States, we have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the world's prison population. Per capita, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, which, if one takes a moment to think about that, think about some tyrannical regimes across the globe that you think would have high incarceration rates. The United States exceeds all of those, places like China or Iran or other areas where we assume that because of the totalitarian government, lots of people are incarcerated. But the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And nearly half of those prisoners who are in state prisons are locked up for nonviolent offenses. We assume that most of the people who are incarcerated are there because they're dangerous to us or dangerous to themselves. But statistically, that's just not the case. Most of the people who are in prison now are in prison because of nonviolent offenses. Many of those are drug and alcohol-related offenses. We have a high percentage of people who are in our prison system who are mentally ill. So that has, both of those factors have added to the increase in our prison population, which has been a drain on our budget. By 2007, the United States spent more than $44 billion on incarceration and related offenses. That's 127% jump from 1987. Over that same period of time, our funding for higher education rose just 21%. Let me give you an example here in Kentucky. It costs the state government $20,000 per year to house one person in prison. We spend about $9,000 per student, K through 12, in public education in Kentucky. This is not dissimilar to many states across the country where, because of our burgeoning prison populations, a significant part of our state government now is devoted to incarceration and prison-related industries. We now call this the prison industrial complex in the United States. The United States prison population rose by 700% from 1970 to 2005, which outpaces dramatically our population growth rate. So we wonder, why is this happening? Many of the people who are locked up now are locked up for, as I mentioned, drug and alcohol offenses. Many people are locked up because of pre-trial circumstances. They are awaiting their trial. They're not convicted. They can't make bail. And they occupy a part of our jail population. We have many folks who are in prison and jails who are there for parole and probation violations. A disproportionate number of these folks are people of color. We'll talk about why that is in just a moment. We've now realized that for the past 40 years, we have waged a war on drugs in our country. It's actually the longest war that we have engaged in the United States in our history. We have spent more than $1 trillion on this war and have arrested 45 million people. That makes us the world's largest jailer. But the reality is that what we thought we were going to be doing with the war on drugs, which was mainly trying to embody the drug trafficking that was coming into the United States, try to disassemble some of the cartels and address and attack those who are major drug distributors. That's really never happened. What we've discovered is that most of the people who are arrested and have been arrested have been people who are users of drugs, people who are addicted to drugs, most people who are smaller dealers of drugs. And there has not really been a significant impact on the number of drugs that are being distributed in the United States. And in fact, today drugs are cheaper, purer, and more available than ever. In Kentucky and in Indiana and in Ohio, we have a heroin epidemic right now because it's the cheapest street drug that's available. Every time we try to address some of the drug use by arresting people, another drug pops up for people to utilize. I think most people now recognize that the war on drugs has been a dramatic failure. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, a great resource is a documentary film by Eugene Janecki called The House I Live In. He filmed this in more than 20 states and interviews people from dealers to their families, to narcotics officers, to politicians, as well as inmates and judges, who give their insights to what they all concur to be a failed war on drugs. This is a documentary that looks through a lot of different lenses and is a real helpful tool to get people to give people a full understanding of this particular issue and this particular problem. So I recommend that if you're interested in getting a group of people together for a study. It's very provocative and raises a lot of questions for discussion. As I alluded to before, the most significant impact of this failed war on drugs has been its disproportionate effect upon people of color. Well, what we want to conclude is that people of color are committing more crimes. They're using drugs at a higher rate, and that's why they're being more of them are being arrested. But the reality is that there's no greater use of drugs. There's no more preponderance of crime being committed by people of color than by Anglos. And in fact, what we see in statistics is that the number of people who are incarcerated, however, are disproportionately people of color. So 1 of every 106 adult white males 18 years of age or older is incarcerated. 1 of every 36 Hispanic males 18 years of age or older is incarcerated. And then when we look at African American males over the age of 18, it's 1 in every 15. This is, I think, an illustrative chart that basically indicates that the people who use drugs across the board, it doesn't vary by ethnicity or by race. But the drug war was waged primarily in communities of color. Human Rights Watch says that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illicit drugs than whites, but have a higher arrest rate. We'll talk about the reasons behind that in just a moment. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that the number of people who are under state jurisdiction for drug offenses by race, African Americans greatly exceed those who are white Americans, and yet the number of African Americans is significantly lower than the white population in the United States. And if you go down that list and look at virtually every drug, the white population uses drugs more readily than the African American population. So there's a disconnect with respect to what we're doing with respect to incarcerating people and what is in reality the use of these particular drugs. Michelle Alexander spends a great deal of time in her what I'm going to call a classic book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, talking about this very issue, about why this, why we have overcrowded prisons and why there's a disproportionate number of people of color in those prisons in the United States. She names that as the new civil rights issue in our country, because what has occurred has been in many ways a systemic problem that has focused on a particular population in our culture. The reason for that is that when we waged the war on drugs, we pumped a lot of money into law enforcement agencies and gave them an incentive to arrest those who were using drugs and those who were distributing drugs and those who were manufacturing drugs. But it was it made sense for drug enforcement officials if they were getting more money for arrest and conviction to move into places of higher density population areas. And so a lot of the activity in drug enforcement occurred in urban areas where there was a higher population of people of color. And so the number of people who were arrested and convicted became disproportionate to those who were actually using drugs. And this became something that was exacerbated over the years as more money was pumped in and more arrests were being made, resulting in now an overcrowded prison system that is not only in the state correction systems across the country, but also in our federal system. Michelle Alexander is a civil rights attorney. This is a well-written, well-documented book, and we're going to talk about why this is an important book for us to look at and study. Here's another chart just to give some visualization to this particular issue with respect to arrest rates for marijuana possession. Now, we realize that there's a movement in our country to decriminalize the use of marijuana in a couple of jurisdictions already. But this particular chart shows the glaring disparity between those who are arrested for the use of marijuana for this 10-year period. African Americans comprise 14% of drug users. However, 37% of those arrested were African Americans for drug offenses. And there's 25.4 million adults arrested for drugs in this nearly 30 or 40 year period. 1 in 3 were African Americans. What we discover is that the prison population has been radically increasing, but the rate of crime has actually leveled out in our country. Many of the people who are in prison are there because they have violated parole. And then we also have the stigma of people who have been convicted of felons with a high recidivism rate now of about 35 to 40% in many jurisdictions, because the difficulty for people who've been arrested and have felony convictions to move back into our society and to successfully assimilate has become more and more difficult. This is the chart that talks about the likelihood of males going to state or federal prison by race from 1974 to 2001. If you look at this chart, the top line, which is obviously much higher than the other three lines below it, are black males. The second line is for Hispanic males. All males are that dotted line, and for white males, it's the lower line. So all of these things begin adding up, and we understand that there's in many ways, a rather targeted population where African American males have been taken out of their communities, taken out of their homes, taken out of their families at a disproportionate rate, and there's really no sound reason for that. What I'm going to talk about now that we understand that there's this systemic problem that we have, not only because prisons are overcrowded and we can't afford to build anymore, and it's draining our budget, and we're spending so much more money on the back end of corrections as opposed to the front end of prevention and rehabilitation and restoration. What April talked about was our church's focus on not only studying this issue, but trying to respond to it. One of the things that we've done in Kentucky is a book study of Michelle Alexander's book, the one that I just mentioned. We decided that this was a way to gather people together to focus on this particular topic in a very intentional and deliberate way. There are lots of other book studies that can be used as a vehicle. There's lots of other approaches that can be utilized, but we've had success with this, and we wanted to share this as one model for people to replicate and perhaps use in their own communities. The way that this came about is we basically issued a call for those who may be interested after that resolution came down from the General Assembly. And what we discovered was that we had a pretty diverse group of people who got together, of different age groups, different ethnicities, different races, some clergy, some lay people. We had about 12 people who gathered, and we met for prayer and study and discussion. And we covenanted to meet together as we worked through this particular book. We scheduled those meetings quarterly. They usually lasted from about 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., but obviously that varies with respect to the group and the interest level as the availability of people in those groups. There have been published now several study guides that go along with Michelle Alexander's book. The one that we used was from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which we found to be helpful because it's a faith-based study guide, and it not only helps illustrate some of the points in Michelle Alexander's book, but it also gives some very insightful biblical references as well as references from other readings. So this was the book that everybody purchased, and we made available to those who needed it as a way to guide us through this process. As we gathered together, we looked at Nathan Rushstein's Healing Racism for America guidelines, which is just a way to establish dialogue guidelines for the group. We wanted to make sure that our conversations were honest and fair, and that we were sensitive to one another. We met at centralized locations. We moved around the Commonwealth of Kentucky to different churches. We maintained the same agenda, which seemed to work for us. We opened with devotions and worship. We did some sharing. In the beginning, we did some icebreakers. We began catching up. Part of our purpose was to develop community, but to get to know people pretty well. Oftentimes, when we try to do interracial dialogue groups, we meet once or twice, or we have a joint worship service together, but we don't really get to know one another. We don't begin sharing our lives with each other. We don't engage in intimate conversation, and that can only happen when relationships are built. So we focused on building community and getting to know one another, and we also stress deep listening, that we listen well to one another, and we made ourselves very present as we gathered as a group. We began this process with the practice of Lectio Divina. I'm not going to go through that process, but what it did for us is it not only provided a centering point and a biblically based centering point for us, but it allowed us to think how this particular passage spoke to us, how it spoke to us as a group, and how it spoke to us as the wider church. And we found that this process knitted us together in a very spiritual way as we moved along this journey with one another. We looked at a chapter from Alexander's book each time we gathered together. We developed prompt questions with respect to that. Sometimes we broke down into smaller groups. Sometimes we met in the full group. The discussions were not only provocative, they were heartfelt. They were sometimes very difficult conversations for us to have. But as we moved along this process, it brought us closer and closer together. We shared lunch. We felt that we needed to break bread together. That was another way of bonding and forming community. And we found that the discussions got deeper, not only about the topic, but we found that we got to know each other better. And we began to care about each other in much more significant ways. We closed with conversations, summing up what we did. We looked to the future. Some very interesting things have come out of this. We're hoping now to be trained by April, to be better equipped to go out into the region, so that we can begin helping form new study groups like this, because we think this is a valuable and very constructive tool to address this very important issue. And then every time we met, we closed with the Lord's Supper. It was a way that we felt was once again reminding us whose we are and who we are as part of the body of Christ, and looking at this very important issue. Our meetings always began and ended with worship. We looked at that as spiritual bookends, and it became very important for us as we bonded together as brothers and sisters in Christ. April's going to talk about some other resources that other groups have been using and utilizing along the way. So I'm going to turn it back over to her.
Sources, just in case we don't want to talk people, and then we can ask more questions at the end as well. So you all know, there are only about 3 slides left. So, but are there any questions that are really on top of the mind for you all before we move forward? Okay. So what I'm going to share with you this evening, and I feel like the sun is setting, so I'm probably disappearing on your screen right now. There are several ways in which our congregations and our church judicatories have been engaging in this conversation around mass incarceration. And one of the first ones I want to share with you, which is similar to what they did in Kentucky, is Illinois, Wisconsin has a region-wide book read. In 2013, they announced that they'd be reading Ernest Gaines' A Lesson Before Dying. And they read the book region-wide, and then at the Regional Assembly, which is between General Assemblies, they then get together and have a discussion. I have a website there if anyone is thinking about looking at this this book study, and this is a website that from the publisher that also has a study process for folks that would be interested. And then I thought that there are some classic books that we all know about, and Dean kind of alluded to. So I have the To Kill a Mockingbird on the next slide. That, oh, do I have control? I have control. Oh, Lord. Okay. To Kill a Mockingbird is a book that we all, probably read in high school and forgot. And also there's a movie. So there are ways that folks have gotten together to just have discussion. And so they have thought about either doing a book read or having what I'm calling on this slide, the next slide, a film fellowship. So a way for congregations to get together and see a movie together and do what Dean kind of talked about, and that is some ways in which we let our guard down and are able then to talk to each other about, how we have different lived experiences and how we got to this place of mass incarceration and different access to education than our dominant culture. So one of the books that we are going to probably launch as a church-wide book read in the next 2 years is this book by Brian Stevenson. He is the executive director and founder of the Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, Alabama. Brian now is probably a shooting star, to say the least. He is on the President's Task Force for Police Community Relations, so he is a go-to person. But Brian's book, and I brought a prop, so I have it because I won't let anybody borrow it. Just want to share that with you all. Is an excellent read. It reads like a novel, and as a matter of fact, some of us are recommending that if you want to have a conversation, the intro conversation, you may want to start with Just Mercy and then proceed to Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. So again, this book reads like a novel. It's very hard to put down. It's a very quick read. And Brian's take on this, Brian has a particular focus in his work. He works with people who do not have any way to get representation and who typically are on death row. But right now he focuses on children who have been sentenced to die in prison. And these are children who may have, under 14 years old that may have been a victim of abuse, may have some developmental issues, and have been, again, sentenced to die in prison with no representation. So this is what Brian's Institute does. Lastly, some of you may recognize this. Hopefully you all recognize this and have seen this in your congregations. We, to raise awareness around mass incarceration, we also wanted to raise awareness around how did we get here. And a lot of what we are finding when we study, and you'll see in Michelle's book and many other books, is that there is a phenomenon called the school to prison pipeline. And many of our congregations are studying that, and some of them are actually working on restorative justice in ways that young people who are getting harshly punished for maybe fighting in school, how is it that there can be some other type of mediation and some more diversion programs so that they don't end up in prison. So we want to raise awareness, one, for our church-wide offering, but also how we might want to have our congregations focus on how do we prevent our disproportionate number of Black and brown youth going straight into the prison as opposed to college. So that was our focus for last year, and I believe this is my very last slide. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you all is that we also have trainers in our office, what Dean referred to. So out of the Office of Reconciliation Ministry, we have folks that go out and do anti-racism training. But what we have found is prior to 2008, Reconciliation Ministry was a training ministry. but we didn't really leave people with anything to do. And so we're finding that we need to be a little more dynamic in our work. And so some of the things that we have recommended here in terms of maybe doing a book study, maybe doing a fellowship, ways to enter into a conversation may be a first step. And then we totally invite you to call our office and look at a training so that you can then understand what you just studied.
Thank you to both April and Doug. This indeed was a powerful presentation and some really helpful tools as we envisioned giving to our congregations to get started. There are a few questions, and for those of you that do have questions that you did not put on the chat feature, you're welcome to do that at this time as we go through some of the ones that are recorded, or you can email us, as I mentioned earlier, and there are some email addresses listed for you. The first question, perhaps I think it goes to Dean. I'm going to do it as a two-part question. One is, how might our congregation learn more about being a Mission Behind Bars faith community? And I think they really mean not necessarily Mission Behind Bars in terms of organization, but how might they get involved? And then I'm going to add to that, what's the best way to get a group together, especially getting a balance of diversity within that group?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, Monica. That's a program that we began in the Kentucky region. We started with a prison congregation, partnering with Prison Congregations of America, which is an ecumenical group that plants prisons plants congregations within actual prisons, and calls a pastor to lead those congregations, and then invites outside congregations to come in and worship. What developed from that in Kentucky was a mentoring reentry program, which we operate as Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, where we train small groups of 3 to 5 people to work with returning citizens upon their release from incarceration, and it's been very successful on both ends. One, to revitalize some of the mission experiences of our congregation, but also to help returning citizens have a successful reentry process. If individuals are interested in this type of ministry, and a lot of churches are involved in some types of prison ministries, a lot of those prison ministries go on inside and behind the bars. Not as many are involved outside beyond the bars, but that's really where the need is for so many people. I mentioned earlier the recidivism rate of 35 to 40% has been dramatically reduced by those folks who work with a nurture, support, and accountability group. And so it's a wonderful way for congregations to respond to Jesus' message in Matthew 25, because we haven't really been too vigilant in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and many other mainline denominations in working with people who are incarcerated and working with them as they return to their communities. But what we discover is that of all the people who are incarcerated right now, 95% of them are coming back to our communities. And so the church needs to be prepared as a welcoming community to help those folks become good parents, become good spouses, become good community members, become good employees, and surrounding them with nurture, support, and accountability group is one way to do that. From those groups, that people's interest in this particular topic grows. One of the challenges that we often talk about is how do we get together a diverse group. Our congregations are pretty segregated with respect to racial composition. Yes, sometimes we get together at regional assemblies or general assemblies, and sometimes we'll do joint worship services, as I mentioned before. But really engaging one another, we haven't been too successful in doing that. One of the things that we've discovered is by inviting different congregations to come to worship at one of our prison congregations is a way of getting people to engage in that particular type of mission together. when we worship together, something special happens, I think. Uh, and so that's one of the ways that we can begin developing relationships across some of those racial lines. But this is such an important issue, I think, for everyone. When we sent out a call to people across the region in Kentucky about asking people who might be interested in this study, we were pleasantly surprised by people who responded from both African American traditions as well as from Anglo traditions to get together. Another way of doing this is actually to try to intentionally do that within your community, to try to find other congregations in your community that may be interested in engaging in this study. In Lexington, Kentucky, 4 congregations got together and studied this particular group, each separately, studying Michelle Alexander's book, and then came together for sort of a small assembly to talk about it. And that was a very successful way of doing it. There's no magic formula. I think a lot of it is just developing relationships, focusing on this very important issue, and understanding that this is an issue for the whole church.
Excellent. Thank you, Dean. And I want to point out that NBA is committed also to helping this process of educating and engaging congregations. And so if your congregation is interested in having Dean come out and help do some of the training around being a welcoming congregation, or some training around what Mission Behind Bars does, we'd be happy to discuss that option with you and see how we can support that. So please know that. A question for you, April. This comes from Patrick Felton. Could you explain where funds from the reconciliation offering goes? Members of his congregation have asked him about it, and he wants to use it as a literacy moment. How might that be used?
Definitely wanted to. So Reconciliation Ministry receives an annual, what we call special offering, at the last week of September and the first week in October. So the last Sunday in September and the first Sunday in October, we take a church-wide offering to our mission fund. And those funds go to fund our granting process, in which we give award grants to general ministries, regional ministries, and recognized ministries of the church that want to focus on anti-racism programs. And so how do I say this? I always say that the ministries of our church are actually the program of reconciliation, since we are at bottom, we are a mission fund. So all of our funding comes from that special offering. But check your email tonight, because you'll be getting a special appeal from Reconciliation Ministry so that we can have more funds to address some of the granting needs that people want to have these conversations with regard to why are we having riots in the streets in Baltimore? Why are we having protesters in New York and Ferguson? How did we get here? And so we are doing a special appeal so that people can begin to have these conversations, and using the special appeal funding process to do that. I hope that was helpful. And one of the things I wanted to add about the question that Dean responded to earlier, with the difficult part about having diverse people in the conversation around mass incarceration or the manifestations of racism, is that I was listening to, oh God, I can see him. Listen to a speaker, oh gosh, I have his book, the other a couple months ago, and he made a comment that he speaks in a lot of congregations, and many of them ask this very same question: how do we do this when we are a homogenous congregation? And his answer is, you're fooling yourselves if you believe that your congregation is homogenous, because you assume that because you may have the same skin color, that you don't have any diversity within your congregation. And one of the things that Dean knows very clearly about, he experiences all the time, is that in our congregations, people are ashamed to tell you that their sons and daughters and their relatives are in prison. And so the point is to just make an invitation and an entree, and as you build relationship and trust, this conversation can spread, and then some more diversity can come into that conversation.
Well, if I may add to that, two ways. Our prison congregation, which is very diverse, by the way, uh, for the fact that we are inside a women's detention facility, we actually have received some funds from Reconciliation Ministry. We submitted an application to the Kentucky region, and part of our ministry is funded by Reconciliation funds because we feel that what we're doing there is moving us toward not only a more reconciling ministry within the congregation, but also addressing some of the other issues with respect to racism as they apply to people who are incarcerated. The second point that you made, as I travel around and talk to congregations and folks about this particular issue and working with people who are returning from prison, the statistic that I share with them is that 1 in 31 people in the United States is either in prison, jail, or under supervision of some type, either probation or parole. That's a shocking figure for lots of people, and what that tells us is that most of us in our families are affected in some way by this. And I discovered that almost every day when I run into someone who tells me about a son or a daughter who has been imprisoned or incarcerated, or a family member that's been imprisoned or incarcerated. And April is right, we have a sense of shame about that. And until we begin recognizing that this is in some ways a cultural problem right now that we need to address and deal with, until we begin opening up that dialogue to people, it's going to continue to be suppressed, and we're not going to be able to make any changes and move in the right direction. Because part of what we need to do is begin making some legislative changes. We need to look at some of the laws that insist upon mandatory minimum sentencing that the federal system has right now, which has brought up the significant number of people who are incarcerated in federal prisons because there is no parole there. We have a number of states where people who have been convicted of a felony don't have the right to vote. We have boxes on applications where people have to check whether they've been convicted of a felony, which in most cases will mean that they're not going to get a personal interview for a place of employment. The minimum wage is so low that people who are returning citizens, even when they get a minimum wage job, they can barely make ends meet. So we have to create a system where people can succeed and they can be shame or security, particularly a faith-based community, is where our money is going. We're spending much more money on the punitive and retributive part of the justice system, and much less on the restorative and rehabilitative part of the justice system. We need to move people out of prisons who are mentally ill. We need to move people out of prisons who have been addicted to drugs and alcohol and are in the process of recovery, and move them to healthy places where they can be restored and become the people that God created them to be.
Excellent. And speaking of the legislative process, of course, we just ended about a week and a half ago our time at the Ecumenical Advocacy Days, where clergy and lay alike activists came together in Washington, D.C. to talk about breaking the chains, mass incarceration, and systems of exploitation, and to lobby on that Monday afterwards around legislation. So I have two questions around that. One, we hear a lot about the war on drugs. Michelle Alexander obviously speaks about that a lot in our book. And Dean, you mentioned earlier Hillary Clinton beginning to speak out about that. If the drug war has truly failed, should we be in favor of legalizing drugs? And what are the dangers of that? Is one question. So should we be in favor of legalizing drugs, and what are the dangers of that? And the second question is, are there laws that need to be changed, or what are those laws that need to be changed or revisited to reduce mass incarceration?
Take it, April.
Well, the first part of the question is, should we decriminalize drugs. There is a huge lobby of law enforcement officials, police officers unions that are advocating for decriminalization of drugs, particularly marijuana, because, well, for many reasons, but economic reasons always are the motivation, but also because of our resources. It really bogs them down in terms of resources and what they're doing. And these are people that have, as Dean was saying, these are people that have illness. They are not criminals. Their illness may cause them to do petty crime, but they are not a threat to society. So again, the law enforcement lobby and unions are advocating strongly for decriminalization of marijuana. Um, the second question was, what was it, Monica?
Are there laws that need to be changed, or what are the laws that need to be changed or revisited to reduce mass incarceration?
Okay. So the first one that comes to mind, and then Dean's the attorney, he can really add more to this. The first one that comes to mind is the three strikes. Particularly if you're three strikes and you got caught with, with marijuana on you. So then three strikes means you mandatory minimums. And judges are also having taken issue with that because they're not ruling. This is what they have to rule. So it's not as if these are mean judges. This is what they're it's imposed on them to rule, and they've met people that can definitely be recidivized or not helped by being punished. So they would prefer that we get rid of the three strikes and also the three strikes, the mandatory minimums. It also is overly incarcerating people for nonviolent offenses. We recently had an effective lobby around the cocaine and crack laws, and so there is some hope in getting these changed. And that was, cocaine was being, crack was being more heavily punished than cocaine was, and so we had some success just about 5 years ago in getting that law changed, and so that it's equal. So the other piece too is we want equal. We want equal punishment, equal equal laws for these for drugs, so that we don't have a disproportionate part of a particular racial group being affected. Particularly poor people are more likely going to be on drugs or be caught by drugs. And that's why in our communities we are finding more and more people who are not talking about their family members that are in prison, because we're finding, as Dean was saying about heroin and meth. No one's talking about that, and so those people need to be with health agencies, not with the justice system. So those are three laws that I know that definitely that need to be addressed, and we have been lobbying for. Dean probably knows more because he's an attorney.
Well, it's complicated to some extent. I mean, there are a lot of factors that go into this, but one of the most significant factors has to do with the finances. And what many legislatures are realizing is that we just cannot continue this process of incarcerating people and overcrowding our prisons. Most of our prisons were built for about a third of the people who are housed in those particular prisons, and so what the result of that is that most of the services that are provided in our correctional institutions are for safety and security, as in some ways they should be, but we haven't been able to then redirect that to rehabilitative services so that we can prepare people for when they return to our community. Because we can't afford to keep building new prisons, many of our legislators, and they need to be encouraged, are beginning to look at some of the laws and release people from prison for lesser offenses, for nonviolent offenses. Those people who are less likely to recommit a crime, and many people who need to be in recovery programs. And so more money is being allocated for recovery programs because we know that per capita it costs about a half of per person per year to have somebody in a recovery program than it does in a place of incarceration. So there's some movements that are going on, but we have to have the pendulum switch so that we look as a nation upon these issues much more compassionately, and we understand that some of these laws that were enacted 30 or 40 years ago to be tough on crime really hasn't affected the crime rate. We, we seem to be incarcerating more people, even though the crime rate seems to be level. So programs like restorative justice programs that begin diverting people, particularly juveniles, from the criminal justice system, as well as beginning to hold adult offenders more accountable for what they have done and giving victims a voice in the whole process. Those movements continue to bubble up, and I give God thanks for that, because I think much of that is the Spirit's work. But we also need to look at the nuts and bolts of our criminal justice system, and I mean, April's right. In the federal prison system right now, and the federal judicial system, judges have sentencing guidelines that they don't have much discretion with respect to. That's why there's a group of people that are trying to change the mandatory minimum sentence laws. In a lot of our state legislatures, as April mentioned, there are persistent felony offenses, so that you have somebody that commits a third felony. It might be for writing a check for $200, a bad check for $200, but they have past felonies 10 or 15 years ago, and they are ending up serving life sentences. We need to be much more deliberative and intentional about how we address these issues, and then also do some self-examination about why there's been such a focus on a particular population and the effects that it has on that particular population.
Excellent. Well, if there are no more questions, this ends our question and answer portion of our webinar. I ask that you please consider the many ways you and your congregation might get involved or further your ministries to address prison and jail issues. Again, I mentioned that if you are in need of help and assistance in getting your congregation engaged, please contact us at NBA, and we will do our best to support you in those efforts. Our contact information for our prison and jail ministries is Reverend Bucalis is Dean, and his email is there, prisonministries@nbacares.org. If you want to reach Reconciliation Ministry, Reverend April Johnson, ajohnson@disciples.org, or myself as a program director for the Disciples Care Exchange and our affinity groups. You can reach me at mkilpatrick@nbacares.com. We ask that you would stay tuned for our final webinar in this series to take place after the 2015 General Assembly in July, so it'll be post-July. The topic will be on special populations, tools to equip the congregations to welcome those on the margins. And so that may include re-entering citizens that may have been sex offenders or other crimes such as those. Remember to like NBA on Facebook, visit our NBA webpage, visit also the Reconciliation webpage, Reconciliation Ministry, to get connected. You can complete a form, an online interest form on the NBA